Good afternoon. On behalf of Department of Computer Science and Technology and our local Gyan committee, we are happy to have the inaugural session as well as the first session of Gyan course by Professor Aditya Ghose at Goa University. I request Professor V.V. Kamath, Head of Computer Science Department, and Dr. Sudhir, who is the Gyan Coordinator, to escort Professor Aditya Ghose on the dais. Yeah, for some time at least. So, we have a very short formal inaugural. In fact, the inaugural was planned for yesterday, but there was a slight misunderstanding and we are having it today. And Vice Chancellor Professor Varun Sahni was also supposed to be the part of the inaugural ceremony, but today because of his other busy schedule, he cannot make it. But we are going ahead with the inaugural as well as the first session. So first of all, I welcome all of you. First, let me welcome Professor Aditya Ghose, who has come all the way from Australia to conduct this course. In fact, this course was supposed to be held in first week of December and all preparations were made. But due to some unavoidable circumstances and ill health of Professor Aditya Ghose, it was postponed and immediately he actually adjusted and got these new dates. So thanks to Professor Ghose for keeping the commitments and making this course possible. It is a prestigious thing that Gyan course or Gyan facility was extended to Goa University. Very few universities and institutes in India are having this scheme, where central government and MHRD had sanctioned this scheme, and under this scheme we are allowed to invite internationally reputed professors. And the first proposal which was sent by our university was for the course on computational service science by Professor Aditya Ghose, and we were happy that the first proposal which was sent was readily approved by Gyan core committee, and today we are having its inaugural. We expect and hope that more and more Gyan courses, not only in the field of computer science, but in other branches which are offered at Goa University will also happen, and this will enrich the campus and the students. Now I request Professor V.V. Kamath to say a few words before we have the inaugural session.
Thank you, Ram Rao. Now, so first of all, let me welcome all the students of semester 4. So this course has been made as a part of your software engineering course with a purpose. Okay. So you will be wondering, the title of the course says Computational Service Science. I mean, how do you relate it to this particular course in software engineering, right? Now, you may have heard this before, but let me repeat it for the sake of completeness. When computer science was started, I mean, it unfortunately got the name computer science. Some people started saying that computer science is not same as information technology. They coined a new term, information technology. Then people said that software engineering is not same as computer science, right? And they said that computer science is different, software engineering is different, because it's at scale, whereas computer science, we look at small things, right? Things. So it's like micro versus macro. It's like quantum physics versus relativity. Then people said computational science is not same as computer science, right? So now you have a separate branch called computational science, and many branches of science, biology, chemistry, medicine, finance, are all now looking at this computational science because they are all dealing with this challenge of big data, right? So that is computational science and not same as computer science. Now this is a new animal called computational service science, because now we are realizing that the softwares are meeting the client. So the client has an interface through a software, right? And software is being looked upon as a service. So this is now being coined. So I am seeing that some universities are already offering a course on computational service science, a graduate program in computational service science, and I'm sure that it's an interdisciplinary course open to management, science, engineering, right? So I think this is something very interesting, and I think our students should look at this, particularly those who are interested in research and those who want to study further. I think there is a lot to learn from these new disciplines which come up, right? And I'm sure that this particular course will benefit all of you. I am very thankful to Professor Aditya Ghose for having kept the commitment, having come here, and this course we will start today and will end it on 18th. 18th is an exam that's being scheduled, and it's mandatory for all those who are attending this course as a part of software engineering. Okay, so with that brief introduction, I will invite Ram Rao to say a few things about the next program.
Now I request our coordinator, Gyan coordinator, Dr. Sudhir, to present a bouquet to Professor Aditya Ghose to welcome him to university and to conduct this course. So now I request Professor Aditya Ghose to say a few words to mark the inaugural, and later on, after this inaugural is over, he will be starting his formal session. But maybe because we have our Gyan committee members, other professors, other participants, and it would also benefit your address to them. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Kamath, Professor Wagh, Dr. Sudhir. Some of you might know that I was here in this room only about a year and a half back. We were running an international conference on service-oriented computing, which is very closely related to what we're talking about here. And I think the genesis of the idea that we might do this course happened at that conference, where Professor Wagh was very, very active and instrumental in making, I was just telling him, one of the most successful conferences in that series, as advised to me by the steering committee of the conference. So we did a very good job, and I think that Professor Wagh was very much to blame for having done a very good job. So Professor Kamath was spot on when he described what's happening here and what we're aiming to do. I'm going to talk in a lot more detail about what I plan to do and so on. But I think Professor Kamath highlighted the fact that there is a teaching pedagogic component to this thing, particularly interesting to people who want to build a career in research, but also people who might not. I am a great believer of the saying that good teaching is not about filling buckets, right? So there is this idea that you fill buckets. I give you a lot of detail, the bucket's full, you go away with a heavy bucket. But I think good teaching is about lighting fires, right? So that is what I'll try to do. I'll try to light fires. Whether I'll succeed or not, I don't know. At this point, I'm failing because Professor Kamath at some point said to the group of students here, move forward. So out of respect to the head of department, they moved forward. All of you moved forward by one row, right? You're still about 5 rows away from the front. I was saying this is the propriety of Indian students. We are always respectful. We don't feel the need to sit very close to the front. That's reserved for older people like us, right? So, but in any case, I'm very happy that I'm here. As you can tell, I am from India, and I've spent the first 22 years of my life in India and the next 28 years of my life outside India. I'll talk a bit more about what I've done so you can understand my background. So yeah, what else can I say formally? Many thanks.
Thank you, sir. As you rightly said, that last year your visit actually proved beneficial to us. We could experience one of the best international conference in this field, and that actually motivated us to invite you as a faculty. It is very difficult, as we found out, to get a faculty to get his schedule, but I think Professor Ghose made all sort of adjustment, and finally the course is on. In fact, we faced a lot of hurdles on the way. As I said, it has to be also postponed. In between, I was also absconding, and there were a lot of other difficulties, but I think Professor Kamath, my other department colleagues, as well as Sudhir, and not to forget about Nandesh, they kept all the arrangements in flow, and finally we are here for the course. I request Professor Sudhir, who is the Gyan coordinator, to propose vote of thanks, and that will be then soon followed by a lecture session. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Aditya Ghose for coming all the way from Australia. Such a nice place there. It looks similar to Goa, I suppose. And I would like to thank our Vice Chancellor, who unfortunately could not be here, but he had continuously supported the program. And talking about the Vice Chancellor, the former Vice Chancellor, Professor Shettier, he was actually very much interested in bringing the GAN program, so I should actually thank him too, although he's not here. And I thank the GAN screening committee members, 3 of them are here, who helped a lot for screening the proposal and to form the guidelines. I also thank the faculty of Computer Science Department who proposed the first proposal from Goa University. And I thank all the participants, all the students especially who are here today. I hope you keep this rigor throughout the course and you gain a lot of knowledge after this course. I would also like to thank Nandesh, who I don't know if he's here around. He was very helpful, and because of him we could make all these arrangements in a short notice. So I thank all of you again. Enjoy the course. Thank you.
So thanks again. Welcome to this course on computational service science. I'm very glad that the students here agreed finally to some very authoritarian instructions to move forward. I think you will enjoy sitting in the front row. It sometimes is a good thing to do, I tell my students. The act of sitting in the back row is an act of saying, you know, I am here under duress, I would rather not engage with this class, right? So you're signaling that if you sit in the back row. If you sit in the front row, you're saying, I'm really interested in what's happening here and I really, really want to engage with this class. So you're doing that now, which is really good. So this is Wollongong, which is it's effectively a suburb of Sydney. It's about 1 hour train ride from the center of Sydney. It's on the seaside, much like Goa. The university is located on the right-hand side of the picture. You see a hill, and it's located at the bottom of that hill. So I've been at the University of Wollongong for almost, well, this year it's 20 years. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what I do so you understand my background, and I have a sense of who you are by hearing Professor Kamath mention the software engineering subjects and so on. So we'll find out a bit more about. So this is the plan for what I hope to do today in this first session. And again, I decided that I'm going to maybe keep some of it flexible, so I will see how things go and mold the material based on what you all say. Now that brings me to the most important point in this story. You must say things, right? So I just heard that in the next door to where we are, there's an event going on that's called the difficult dialogues, right? So difficult dialogues are really important, and I think we should have one too here, because you know, there's this famous idea of a Socratic dialogue, right, which is where you learn by asking questions and getting answers, right? So, and you learn by asking hard questions and getting the difficult answers. I enjoy teaching classes where I get asked questions. I absolutely thoroughly enjoy being interrupted, so please interrupt. Interrupt every minute if you will, because that's what gives me value. I mean, otherwise it's going to be a one-way street. I'll be filling a bucket. It's a bucket that will be heavy. You'll carry it out and then God knows what you'll do with it. Instead, if I light those fires of inspiration, if I get you to really get interested in what I talk about, if you ask me hard questions, if you start by saying, why should I bother with this stuff? I'll be very pleased, because I'll say, okay, now I've got my audience. They're thinking about this. They're going to ask me the hard questions. I will try and answer those questions as best as I can. But the most important thing is there has to be a dialogue. So please, please ask me questions. Feel free to interrupt at every point in the story. So I said I'd start out by telling you my whole life history, right? So that's going to take about 2 hours. That was a joke. I don't know if you got it. You're supposed to laugh. So I was born in a place called Shantiniketan, which many of you might know. It's a university town set up by Rabindranath Tagore. I grew up in a town called Dhanbad, which used to be in Bihar, and these days it's in Jharkhand. And I grew up on the campus of, these days it's a university, it's called Indian School of Mines. So my father was a professor of mining engineering. He retired later as director. I studied at Jadavpur University in Calcutta, Kolkata. I did a Bachelor of Computer Science and Engineering, which is a very interesting thing, because Professor Kamath made reference to the idea that in the early days of this discipline, people used the word computer science, but many didn't like that idea, right? Because that name too closely identified the science to a particular kind of machine, that kind of box that sat on our desks, right? So are we talking about the science of those boxes? Well, they're just boxes, right? There's some electronic hardware inside, but that's really not what computer science is about. So a lot of other people argued that this is about computing. So curiously, after I finished my bachelor's degree in Jadavpur University, I went to Canada, to the University of Alberta. And at Alberta, the department I joined was called the Department of Computing Science. And they were very emphatic about the fact that it was computing and not computer, because computing was quite different from thinking about the science of that box that sat on our desks. Right? So that's what I did. I did a master's and a PhD in computing science at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. I did some very interesting work. When I think back upon it, it was even more interesting in the light of what we're going to talk about now and so on. So I worked on the problem in my PhD thesis of revising knowledge bases, which is a very interesting problem that has received not that much attention in artificial intelligence. Interestingly, artificial intelligence these days is a very powerful word, right? A lot of people, a lot of companies will swear by artificial intelligence, that it's the next big thing. Professor Kamath made reference to the current interest in big data and data science. One of the first things I'll flag, and please engage me in debate, because again, as I said, difficult dialogues, debates, right? I am a great data science or big data skeptic. Even as I engage in doing some of that stuff, I'm a great skeptic. Because I've been around long enough to see fads come and go. It's yet another fad. It has come, but as sure as the sun will set, it will go. In the end, what we are left with is some abiding, enduring principles, knowledge, and so on. And that remains important. So, artificial intelligence has had a similar ride. When I was an undergraduate in Kolkata in the mid-1980s, artificial intelligence was on a high. It was, I used to go to the library, as many of you, I'm sure, do here. I'd open the communications of ACM, and there would be page after page of ads for knowledge engineers. The likes of Ford Motor Company or General Motors, your average manufacturing company, would be hiring hundreds of knowledge engineers, because this is the coolest thing to do. Sadly, that fad didn't last long. So by the late 1980s, people started talking about an AI winter. Right? So artificial intelligence went out of favor for a very simple reason, because it had been hyped up too much. People talked too much about the potential of what AI could do, and a lot of companies bought into it, invested in it, and then realized that the hype didn't match reality, which is a really object lesson for all computer scientists, indeed all academics. Never hype up your discipline, because if you hype it too high, it will come crashing down at some point. Always sell your story with a solid dose of modesty and pragmatism. In any case, AI went through a really low patch. In fact, so low a patch that hundreds of AI scientists, PhDs in AI, got laid off in the early 1990s. There were armies of unemployed AI people wandering around looking for jobs. Well, when I finished my PhD in 1995, all the job ads in North America, and you know the traditional routine for Indian students who end up in North America, right? You finish your PhD and then you look for the best faculty position you can find and you take one. Well, I finished a PhD in AI, and at that time all the job ads in the communications of ACM and so on said, all areas of computer science welcome except AI. So you could see that was a very happy time for me, right? There were no jobs to be had in North America. Consequently, I ended up in Australia. So there goes the story of why I ended up living in Australia for the last 22 years. So I did some interesting stuff, as I said, in my PhD, and I mentioned a couple of those things. Not much of this might make sense. If you're interested, talk to me. There's non-monotonic reasoning, constraint programming, things that play a role in what we're going to talk about in computational service science as well, but maybe a small role in the first instance. So while I was doing my PhD, I also did a couple of other interesting things. So I spent part of my PhD period at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, which is a place that is very closely related to the history of computer science. For those of you who have seen the movie or read the book by Arthur C. Clarke, 2001: A Space Odyssey, where there was a computer, a robotic computer called HAL. So the story was that HAL had been designed at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. But one of my contemporaries at that university at the time was a man called Mark Andreessen. Does that name ring a bell for any of the students here? Students, Mark Andreessen? No? Does the name Netscape ring a bell? Yes? Not the younger generation, right? So the world's very first web browser was being written at the time I was at the University of Illinois. It was being written by this guy called Mark Andreessen, who sat in that building next to mine. It was called Mosaic. So it was the world's first web browser. He used to work for something called the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. And Mosaic was very interesting. I remember the very early days I used to be browsing the web such as it was in those days, not much. But you might be looking at somebody's photograph, for example. It used to render the photograph literally line by line of pixels. So first you'd see the hair on the head, then you'd see the forehead, then you'd see the eyebrows and so on. And you waited patiently for the whole image to eventually download, right? That was the early days of web browsers. So in any case, that was happening while I was at the University of Illinois. I also spent some time at the University of Tokyo during my PhD. Interestingly, the lab where I worked at the University of Alberta did some really cool things. I don't know if some of you have seen the latest news on computer poker. It's come in the news in the last few days, the last 2 or 3 days, right? So computer game playing was a big thing in the AI lab at the University of Alberta. There was a whole bunch of people who were doing that. And they were writing not only chess playing programs, they were also writing checkers playing programs. So for those of you who do follow that, you'll know that checkers is now a solved game, which means that you don't have to do any game tree search. You can just look up a table, right, which says if you're on this state of the board, this is the move you must make and it guarantees a win. So in those days, checkers was not solved, but what it was it was half solved. So you had to play the game really. A computer would have to play the game until the halfway point, and then it was table lookup. So I remember at the time there was this program that in the AI lab, some of the other guys that I knew developed, one of whom went on to CMU and then to IBM and then wrote this program designed this machine called Deep Blue, which in 1997 defeated Garry Kasparov, the world chess champion, right? So all that stuff happened. So it started at the University of Alberta in that lab. Very interestingly, Chinook, the checkers playing program, played a match, a tournament, with the then world checkers champion. So he was a professor of mathematics in a small liberal arts college in Florida. His name was Marion Tinsley. And he had been, I think, world checkers champion unbroken for several decades, 20 or 30 years. He was it. And then he played Chinook and he lost. Well, the story is that sadly he didn't take the losing very well, and within a year of his loss he died. But Chinook proved that, there are certain hard problems where we can get to a point where machine intelligence absolutely, totally outperforms human intelligence. So chess is not one of those. Chess is where machine intelligence kind of sometimes equals human intelligence but doesn't outperform. Poker, we don't know. We're seeing the early days of things like poker. So poker is a game of uncertain information, right? So there's lots of other interesting things going on there. Okay, so as I said, I'm in the business of telling stories and not teaching useful stuff. So at some point, Professor Kamath will say, come on, get to the computer science. Yeah, please, go ahead. AlphaGo, that's right. Very interesting stuff. In fact, remind me, when we get to that point, I'll tell you how we are, in the last few months we've been doing this, using the AlphaGo techniques to improve the execution of business processes. It's a very, very interesting story. So as I said, I made my way to Australia, right, because of the AI winter. And so I joined as a postdoc at the University of Sydney in a group called the Knowledge Systems Group, led by Professor Norman Fu, who sadly passed away 2 years back. And then I went to the University of Wollongong and I established the Decision Systems Lab at the University of Wollongong in 1997. A few other things I did at the University of, so I'll talk a bit more about the Decision Systems Lab in the next 2 slides. A couple of things I did at the University of Wollongong since then was, we had a thing called the Cooperative Research Center for Smart Services. So this is directly pertinent to what we're going to talk about. So that thing existed for about 7 years. So this is part of a program that the Australian government has where they sort of partially fund applied research. So for every dollar that this entity had, 50 cents came from the government, 25 cents from the companies that were partners, and 25 cents from the universities that were partners. And interestingly, amongst the companies that were partners, there was an Indian company, Infosys, with whom we ended up doing quite a bit of interesting work. So that lasted for 7 years, and I'll talk a bit later on in the course about some of the things we did as part of that research effort. I served as the vice president of a body called CORE. I don't know if you are all familiar with CORE. It's kind of infamous because it produced one of the world's first complete rankings of all computer science publication outlets. So CORE used to be a sort of very small body that was the steering committee of the National Computer Science Conference, but suddenly in 2008, the Australian government said to this body, we are going to rank all publication outlets, journals, conferences, and you guys are going to do it. So people panicked, and anyway, so a ranking was produced. And it still exists, but for the first couple of years it was sponsored by the Australian government. And so it is that even today, many European countries use that ranking. So heads of departments find it useful to say yes to travel requests or no to travel requests based on the ranking of the conference and so on. So I also serve as the president of the Service Science Society of Australia, which is again directly related to what we're going to talk about. And just to flag this so that we have interesting conversations, I'm also a hobby historian, so if you've got any interest in history, talk to me, because I thoroughly enjoy talking about history and having historical debates, difficult dialogues. But interestingly, it's, this business of big data and data analytics and so on has turned all of us computer scientists into historians, I think. Why? Because when we mine stuff from data, we are really saying, we're desperately hoping, right? We're hoping that history repeats itself. Because if it does, then all the stuff that we're doing is useful. If it doesn't, it's pointless. But it's also interesting because one of my colleagues in my lab once pointed out, he said, if we only did data analytics as we conceive of it now, in all aspects of technology and engineering, we would today be driving around in really well-designed horse-drawn carriages. Right?
Yes.
Because data analytics does not support those innovative leaps that require, the kinds of things that will lead to you devising a motor car as opposed to a horse-drawn carriage. That's not within the realm of data analytics. So it's really worth our while to keep that in mind. All this stuff is ultimately of limited value. It's also of limited value because there's some very worrying things coming out now. So some of you might have read in the popular press articles that say that the vote for Brexit in the UK and the last US presidential election are sort of signaling the end of this interest in big data. Why? Because all manner of data analytics could not produce the right prediction for these two elections. Right? They could not. So partly it's that, but partly it's also something else, which is a worrying thing when I talk to my management and social science colleagues, because that is the basis for their research method. And that is this. So if you're a management academic, for the most part you're studying, I'm going to come back to management again because there's a lot of management in all this. You're studying a social phenomenon where you're trying to say what kinds of managerial interventions lead to good business performance, for example. And you study that by sending questionnaires to a whole bunch of managers. And these managers then respond by saying, yes, that kind of managerial intervention really works well. And when they say so, you take it at face value. And in the end, you write a paper saying, well, I surveyed so many people, this proportion of them said, it's a good idea. Therefore, it must be a good idea. Something amiss here, right? What's amiss? There is an actual ground truth, an actual reality sitting there. Right? We're not accessing it. We are sort of accessing some intermediary, the humans. Right? So we're asking humans, what do you think? Do you think doing this is a good thing in the ground truth, the reality that you get to see? And we take their opinionated response as ground truth, which is dangerous. Right? Which is dangerous. We should actually look inside at the ground truth and then conclude. Why is that interesting? Because in an election, prior to election, just after election, a pollster might come to a voter and say, if you vote, who did you vote for? It might be unfashionable to say that you voted for somebody. So to reinforce the consensus and to look good, you say, yeah, I voted for this guy, and you didn't. So you have this very funny phenomenon where people have this social pressure to reinforce the consensus. And that's happened with these two elections that we're talking about, which has worried computer scientists quite and many others besides. The people reinforce the consensus. So similarly, you send out a survey and you ask, is doing SWOT analysis a good thing for your business? And all the managers you survey say, well, I really don't think it's a good idea, but if I say so, I'll look bad. So I might as well say, yes, it's a good idea. And suddenly we're getting this biased view of what is the ground truth. So that's very, very worrying. So anyway, so computational historiography, right, which is the idea. So historiography is the sort of set of techniques a historian uses to go about historical research. We're doing computational historiography. And in fact, we're doing lots of it in very, very interesting ways. And I can foresee that there will be a very interesting marriage of computer science and history at some point. That will not be the main focus of what I will talk about in the rest of this course, although in the rest of this course I'll talk about a different kind of marriage, one between computer science and management. So that's an interesting story in its own right. A bit about my research group. So this is a view of our campus. So this is the kind of thing we do. This is the building where we sit. So a lot of our recent activity has involved the application of many of the concepts that I will talk about in this course in clinical settings, in medical settings. And that's actually very rewarding and a very, very insightful exercise for me. And I'll tell you a few things that I learned along the way. So we work closely with radiation oncologists across a network of Australian hospitals, but also there's an international network led by Maastricht University in the Netherlands. So we work as part of that network. One of the interesting problems we've been trying to solve is the problem of clinical data mining. The challenge we face in clinical data mining is that the clinical data cannot migrate by law, by regulations. If a certain amount of data is collected at a certain hospital, it has to stay at that hospital. Now, when you're looking at oncology, it's looking at instances of cancer, it's a funny thing, it's not a big data problem. And it's very happily not a big data problem. We don't want it to be a big data problem. It's a small data problem. The data sets are small. For certain popular kinds of cancers, prostate cancer, breast cancer, and so on, you would have, in an average Australian hospital, 1,000 cases. For the rarer ones, you would have 20, 10, 15, 30. And if you look at a data set inside a hospital, you say, I'll take a data set with 20 instances and I will mine something from it, it's meaningless, right? So you can't do much. So what we've been working on is the idea that we want to be able to mine a network of data stores as if they're centralized without ever centralizing them. So it's a very interesting problem. You never actually migrate the data, but you mine the data as if it has been centralized into a central store. So that is one of the interesting things we do, but there's many other things we do, including clinical process management and so on, which we'll talk about. More recently, we worked on software analytics with Infosys. They don't call them Infosys Labs anymore, but when they did, that was what we did. Also on cloud-based business processes with Xerox, process and service provisioning with IBM Research. In the past, we did a lot of optimization work with local steel plants, with government agencies, and with software vendors. So that's the story of the applied work we did. We did some very interesting formal work in the area of requirements evolution, in the area of learning in agent technology, knowledge-based dynamics, and a few other things that I will talk about, in fact, the last 3 dot points, over the course of these next 6 days. So that was me, right? As I promised, I give you a long history of myself. Now for the subject itself, and we've already had a bit of an introduction from Professor Kama. So what is computational service science? So let's start with what is computing. Right? So I was selling the idea that we should use the word computing and not computer science, and certainly not information technology, because that sort of gives a different flavor. It's funny because a lot of science is about selling the science, and the right choice of words can make all the difference between how well the thing you're selling sells. Right? There's a very famous Japanese sports drink that people in Japan drink a lot, and I remember seeing this for the first time when I spent time in Tokyo in 1994. So curiously, the English translation of that sports drink's name translates to Pocari Sweat. Imagine trying to sell a drink which goes by the name of sweat. So here's a bottle full of sweat, chilled to perfection. Right? Who's going to buy it? So naming has a lot to do. In fact, language has a lot to do with what you end up achieving. So it's a very, very interesting story. So computing is the science of problem solving. Right? It's a science. It's interestingly not engineering. I am by training, by undergraduate training, I am a Bachelor of Engineering. And I really did 2 years of engineering, as many of us did in those days. So there was computer science for 2 years and a lot of engineering for 2 years. So it's interesting. I tend to take the view that computer science, computing science is a science. But it's a science of problem solving. Right? So I sometimes talk to my colleagues about this. So what are we about? So we're really about solving problems. We devise algorithms. Which are descriptions of procedures to solve problems. We don't particularly care where the problem comes from. So a civil engineer will solve a specific kind of problem. A medical scientist will solve a specific kind of problem. We'll solve any problem. If you give me a problem, I'll solve it. That's me. That's a computer scientist. Which is very interesting to think about it from that perspective. Our reach is broad. We look at all kinds of problems. in every possible way. So we are the science of problem solving. There's another interesting angle to thinking about what we're talking about. Computation is actually everywhere. So I was teaching an AI class about 4 years back, and I was in this nice classroom with big windows. And on our campus we had these green big trees, eucalyptus trees. It was a windy day and the trees were sort of blowing, moving in the wind. And I asked the class, can you imagine using that natural phenomenon, the fact that the branches are moving in the wind, can you imagine using that as a piece of computational machinery? The answer actually is yes, you can. In fact, there was one kid in the class who gave me a 3-page document the next day, making that case in some technical detail. I was very impressed. He later on became a PhD student. But it's really true. Computation is everywhere. Why? Because any natural phenomenon that involves state change is computation. We just happen to use certain very specific kinds, where we have these flip-flops, these binary value taking devices that change state from 0 to 1 and back to 4, because they happen to be convenient, but they don't have to be just that. Right? So there's biological computation these days, which takes state change in biological systems as the basis for computation. So computation is about state change. Wherever you have state change, you have computation.
Yeah, I think they're very interesting. I would like to share with you. So, some time back, there was this debate. Our computer science department, or computer science and technology, was put under the faculty of natural science. So we were wondering, computer science otherwise was looked upon as the artificial science, like maths, right? But now, with this kind of thinking that computing is everywhere, even a cell does a computation, okay, I think now it looks okay, it's in natural science.
You're right. In fact, I was thinking of putting that slide in, and then I thought I'd go off a different philosophical tangent, because I was talking about exactly that. So the idea that, so there was this very famous article that argued that computer science was the science of the artificial. Right? So, but I agree, it's not true. It is a natural science. The closest place where where computer science meets natural science is when we talk about the characterization of problems into complexity classes. When you talk about these, you're making statements about nature. You're saying in nature, these problems exist. Very interesting debate, though. Some of you I'm hoping people outside of Professor Kamath will now jump in and say, okay, but is this natural, is this artificial? But really, when you look at a problem, a computational problem, are you looking at something virtual? Is it an artifact of our thinking, or is it something that exists in nature? When you look at service science, right? The idea of services. Is that an artificial virtual construct, or is it a natural construct? At one level, it's an artificial construct, because I'm asking you to look at everything that happens in society through the lens of a service, and think of everything as services being. So you look at ancient society. There was a time when humans as hunter-gatherers did everything. Right? They hunted, they gathered, they plucked fruit, they killed animals, they cooked their food sometimes, and so on and so forth. But eventually there was specialization, right? So some people said, we're good at catching fish, and others said we're good at hunting animals, and others said we're good at plucking fruit. So suddenly you had this business of a service show up, because you said, well, I'll catch my fish, and the guy who does the fruit provisioning service, I'll get my fruit from that person, and so on. So services are a natural phenomenon. They've existed in human society for as long as human society has existed. If I use computational techniques to understand the phenomenon, am I doing an artificial? Am I a science of the artificial? Not really. I am a natural science. So in that sense, yes, we are very much in natural science. We are making statements about nature.
So would you consider maths as an artificial science?
Very good question. I have thought about that.
I
don't know.
Lots of criteria. How did you say it? It has to be natural. No concept, no idea can be artificial. Everything has come from the nature. We talk of anything. Ultimate nature which answers that question. It's nature. That's come from nature.
Yeah, so it's a funny thing, right? I mean, if I take a mathematical concept like an n-dimensional space, right? So n-dimensional spaces don't really exist in nature, but we have trained our brains to think about them. So we think about these axes going off in multiple different directions and a plotted point. Right? So we're trying to create a natural metaphor, but it's really not natural. But then some mathematician will say, you don't know, you can go inside a black hole, or you go to some other planet somewhere else, and suddenly n-dimensional spaces will have a direct natural boundary. Maths is the hardest one.
I've always thought of maths as a language to represent science.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I would certainly buy the idea that maths is a language.
So for this analogy of n-dimensional space, I would say it is art as of now.
It's a language, right? It's just a language. It's very interesting, precise language, but it's a language.
More abstract.
More abstract, yeah. So that takes us to the idea of so what have I done just now in collaboration with Professor Kamath and Professor Bhaskar and our colleague here? Tell me your name.
Shashank.
So we're laying ambit claim to a big space. We're saying, okay, as computing scientists or computer scientists, we are all about all this good stuff, right? So we're making a massive ambit claim, and rightly we should have. Now, let's make this story more specific and focus on one particular space. So for starters, I will focus on that space, but again, I'll keep pointing out that there's other areas where the same ideas are. So the discipline of management. Right? So if you're a management academic, if you're a management practitioner, if you're an MBA, and so on, what kinds of problems do you solve? And I'm using the words problems that you solve very deliberately because remember we said computing scientists are about solving problems. So the problems we solve as a management person would be, what do I do next? As an organization, I'm a CEO, what should my organization do next? Who should be hired? What kinds of organizational structures should be put into place? Now, you'd be surprised, and I pick on this rather otherwise mundane topic and drill down. It's a really interesting question. It has a really interesting history and it has a really interesting computational dimension. Just what's the right organizational structure for my business? So if you think about the idea of large businesses or large firms, including multinationals. So when would you say multinationals started? 1950s, 1930s? So
they are called multinational because they
span multiple nations, right? Exactly. But yeah, it's an interesting question, right? What was the first multinational?
East India Company.
East India Company was definitely multinational, no two ways about it. Was it the first? I'd say not. You know why? Let's take something very close to home. There have been archaeological studies off the coast of Tamil Nadu and Gujarat and so on, where they have found artifacts that belong to the Roman and Greek civilizations. In other words, we were trading with them back in the day of the Greek civilization. Who was doing the trading? Some organization. What were they? They were multinationals. They had traders in Greece, they had traders in other parts of the Greek Empire, they had traders here. There were multinationals even then. Before, or contemporary to the East India Company, right, there were these big business families in Europe, the Rothschilds, for example, banking family. They would send their sons to different countries and say, go forth and set up a branch there. They exchanged information, leveraged information for business value and so on. They were multinationals then, and they are multinationals now. In the early 1900s, US businesses, it's a very interesting history. They, again, the standard story was a business used to be located in a town, a city that was limited geographic reach. Suddenly they said, we don't have to stay within the city, we can go and expand in other cities, in other states, other parts of the country. But suddenly they were saying now, we're used to the standard command and control model where the owner, the boss exerts managerial control locally, and it's very easy. But suddenly, if I have a continent-spanning organization, what's an organization structure that will work? They didn't know, they took recourse to management consulting firms to help them devise organization structures. Is there something natural, in the sense of natural science, about the evolution of organization structures? I'll put to you that there is. You know why? Look at the militaries across the world. Military organizations. You look at the Indian military. We have a standard hierarchy. Look at the officer hierarchy. Right? We have a standard set of how many found recently, about 10-12 steps, sub-lieutenant, lieutenant, captain, major, and so on. So think about militaries across the world, right? The interesting observation is that they all have a similar organizational structure. They all have approximately the same levels in the hierarchy. Why is that? There's something natural about it, right? There's something natural about the number of soldiers a person can command, the number of units a more senior officer can command, and so on and so forth. There's something curiously natural about that. Recently, a lot of Australian universities went through reorganizations of their faculty structures. And I don't know if it was intentional, if the vice chancellors collaborated or sort of conspired to make it happen in similar ways, but almost all universities ended up with about 6 or 7 faculties. They all started with about 12 or 13 and ended up with about 6 or 7. The argument being perhaps that for a manager such as a vice chancellor, it is easier, it is more effective that they manage 6 or 7 lieutenants as opposed to 12 or 13 lieutenants, right? We're making some statements about nature. There is something fundamental about the, right? So there's some magic numbers there. 5 plus or minus 2. It's never minus 2, it's usually plus. Plus 1 or plus 2, yeah. How many faculties does Goa University have? Faculties. How interesting, okay.
Faculties are only 5 or 6.
There you are. So there you are. That magic number. Yeah. So now, interestingly, there is a part of computer science that actually looks at the design of organizational structures. Not so much the organizational structures, but teams.
I would also like to add the art of war presented by South Tzu. He talks about organizational structures, and in one of the recent documentaries that was done by History Channel, they compared what he spoke with the organization structure of Hitler, how mismanaged it was, to the current military structure, and how the proper hierarchy of the rules are there, so that the whatever job is given has a proper way to follow it. So,
our very own Chanakya also spoke of organizational structures in the Arthashastra, right? So there.
Arthashastra, if I'm not wrong, is an economic science. Right?
You'd be surprised. Arthashastra is a pioneering document in many different disciplines. Most recently, the argument has been made that the very first text on mining engineering was Arthashastra. Earlier, that claim was made by some German text from about 400 years back or 500 years back. But now you can go and look at Arthashastra and you'll see statements about how best to do mining. So it's many things. So the computational version of the organizational structure problem, right, is called the coalition structure problem. It basically says I have n agents. I have a function called the characteristic function, which maps every subset of agents to a utility value. Give me the optimal partitioning of this set of agents such that the sum of the utilities is maximized. Really interesting computational problem. You can see this is the baseline for organizational structures, is team formation. Right? Borrows the idea of characteristic functions from not exactly computer science, this is cooperative game theory. So, yeah, but it's a very interesting problem. Right? So, very true. So, in a similar vein, what products should we make and sell? What services should we offer? What customers should we serve, and so on and so forth? Day-to-day management questions. And I'm putting to you that these are all computational problems, which can be solved using computational means. In other words, algorithmic management is a term I started using about 10 years back. It's not taken off like wildfire. You will not see the consulting companies of the world use that term until recently, where somebody pointed out to me that, in very much the same spirit as what I was doing, Gartner recently is talking about algorithmic business. What are they saying? They're saying that a lot of business problems, management problems can be placed on a computational footing, right? Algorithmic footing, right? So it's being talked about. I think at some level, sitting in the background of all of the things we'll talk about is this idea. So it's useful for you to keep that in mind, that we're talking about algorithmic management. We're talking about the conduct of business using computational techniques.
So the next term that I'm seeing now is computational thinking. So it goes one level up.
True, very true, very true.
So trying to look at it before you look at that, algorithmic thing, think computationally. I mean, how can you solve this problem? I mean, is computational thinking?
Very true. In fact, one of the earlier versions of computational thinking is logical thinking, right? So the old idea that you can have really pointless debates, because if you don't use logic, sometimes you use the wrong premises to come to the wrong conclusions, right? So logical thinking precedes all of those things. So, computational? Yes, in fact, that's happening a lot, right? So all of these, there are some very serious algorithms that power the ads that you see on Google and Yahoo and so on and so forth, right? So a lot of that going on.
So don't you think that the previous questions you raised in the previous slide were being tackled by so-called data sciences? I mean, I'm a data scientist from industry, so...
So you are a data scientist from industry and? So you say, what's your question again?
The questions you raised in the previous slide, like what customers do we need to target?
Right.
And the other questions, like they are being like tackled by data scientists as of now in the industry.
Yes, they
I
are.
don't know whether just a term data science as such, but these things are much more being like computational services and data sciences.
So I accept the proposition that you put it that as a data scientist you solve those kinds of problems. Yes. I would put to you that as a data scientist, you're probably looking at it from a slightly narrow lens. And if you were to broaden the lens and look at the full power of computational techniques in general, you'll probably do a better job. I'll tell you why. So again, this is very interesting because this has to do with the history of computer science and the history of artificial intelligence. So when I was doing my PhD, so there was, think of it as two big thought bubbles, right? There was a big thought bubble about reasoning. I write down knowledge and I have to reason about the knowledge and come to conclusions and so on and so forth. That used to be very big in those days. People were really worried about how do we reason, how do we write things down that will help us reason, what is the efficiency of the reasoning process. And there was a tiny thought bubble sitting in the corner which was machine learning. It's tiny. Think about it. If you're a data scientist, it's an instructive lesson, right? And back then, 24 years back, 30 years back, it was a tiny bubble. And people said, yeah, those guys, they do some statistics, they count some stuff and they come to some conclusion. So it was not taken very seriously. Suddenly the roles are reversed now, right? So that small thought bubble is now the big one, the giant in the room. Every company, every CEO, everybody is swearing by it. And the reasoning people almost forget. But that's dangerous. I'll tell you why it's dangerous. So when you use, let's say, deep learning to predict the next word, right? So I'm doing my Google search and it's predicting exactly with absolute accuracy the next word I'm going to type. What's it done? It's built a black box, deep neural net model where some mumbo jumbo is going on that we don't know. Yes. Right? And if you were building a deep learner and you had that black box, and I were to ask you, tell me what's going on inside there, how did you get these responses? You'll say, it doesn't matter, I'm getting the right one. So why should you worry?
That's what business people so-called business.
Correct. It works. It works, therefore shut up. So that's going on inside. And observe, we use a nugget of knowledge that we mine from whatever whiz-bang data analytics we're using. We look at it. I'm going to predict the next word, so I predict the next word. And then it stops. Now imagine being able to extract knowledge using data analytics of various kinds from lots of different places, lots of different data sources, and then connecting them together. Connecting them together so that you can perform inference. One source tells you that A implies B and it stops there. That's all I've done. A very disparate geographic source says, B implies C. But right now the state of play is that A implies B is used at the source where it's mined, and B implies C is used at the source where it's mined. Nobody is connecting the two, because if you did, by the laws of logic, you would say because A implies B and B implies C, I know that A implies C. So that's a nugget of knowledge that we are totally ignored.
The problem with the logic is the incompleteness of knowledge. The knowledge that never become complete. It keeps evolving all the time.
Exactly. So in my PhD days, that was the big thing. How do we reason and
so the data science comes and helps you actually. Data science rather trying to here's the data, now certain data, I set the pattern on this. So knowledge plus data science can play a role. That kind of hybrid approach.
So, yes. In fact, my argument, and I keep saying this to all the audiences I talk to, is that we should, the current state of play, as our industry colleagues will tell us, is that as data scientists, we look at the data as if the data exists in a vacuum. There is the data and there is nothing else.
I totally don't agree with you.
You don't agree? Okay.
In the sense that real data science should try to accommodate the knowledge outside the system as well. But the so-called fad, which I might say, are the so-called data science which is popular right now, we just take the data, put the model, and get the output. But to actually solve data science problem, what I feel is, first of all, I am trying to find the wear and tear of a tire when a vehicle is going on a road. If I just concentrate on wear and tear of a tire and road and conditions and stuff like that, it might give some accuracy. But if I involve the weather conditions as well, and similar like the driving speed and everything else, feature engineering, extra things, that will definitely bump up the accuracy a lot. Right now, what I think in most data scientists try to see is just try to see tiny bit of accuracy, maybe point on point. But to actually get a bump of 10% or maybe 20%, you need to think, you need to
What happens is here also, what we are saying, the data is related to data science. Okay. Data science also, you have a data science, just limits you exactly. So I take a survey of the driving on the road here. This data science limits exactly the inference you get out of it.
Yes, so there's two things in the story that I will
combine this knowledge and data together, you can't see the light another way.
Unless you combine them together. Absolutely my point.